By the middle of the 19th century, naval warfare stood at the edge of a dramatic transformation. In the 50 years following the moment when the Royal Navy firmly established its dominance across the world's oceans, the pace of technological change began to accelerate at a rate unseen in the previous 2 centuries. Advances in industrial manufacturing made it possible to construct ships that were larger, stronger, and more durable than ever before. Steam engines steadily reduced reliance on wind power, while naval artillery continued to grow in both size and destructive capability. One of the most disruptive developments of this era was the introduction of explosive shell-firing guns. For generations, naval combat had relied almost entirely on solid iron projectiles, simple masses of metal designed to punch holes through hulls. The new shells were fundamentally different. Hollow and fitted with fuses, they detonated on impact, combining fire, fragmentation, and blast. Although early versions suffered from inconsistent reliability and limited penetration, their potential was unmistakable. Under favorable conditions, a single broadside could ignite fires and cause internal devastation far exceeding anything solid shot could achieve against wooden warships. At this time, France remained Britain's principal maritime rival. However, France faced a growing disadvantage due to Britain's earlier and more extensive industrial development. Aware that it could not match British shipbuilding output in sheer numbers, France sought alternative solutions that might offset this imbalance. The result was the warship Gloire. While Gloire carried shell-firing guns like many contemporary vessels, her true innovation lay elsewhere. She was the first ocean-going warship to be protected by iron armor. Although her structure was still fundamentally wooden, with iron plates bolted onto the hull, the effect was revolutionary. The design was imperfect and ultimately short-lived, but its impact on global naval strategy was profound, comparable only to the later introduction of the battleship Dreadnought decades afterward. Explosive shells shattered harmlessly against Gloire's iron plating, and solid shot was likewise expected to fail. In practical terms, this rendered most existing naval weapons ineffective. For the Royal Navy, this development could not be ignored. Although Britain had been experimenting with iron construction, steam propulsion, and heavy armor for years, these technologies had been deliberately introduced slowly. Rapid adoption would have made large portions of the existing fleet obsolete, and until Gloire appeared, no rival had forced the issue. That caution vanished overnight. The British response was not merely to match the French innovation, but to surpass it decisively. The result was HMS Warrior. Unlike Gloire, which combined old and new concepts, Warrior was conceived as a fully iron-built warship from keel to deck. This was not an armored wooden ship, but a fundamentally new class of vessel. To avoid unnecessary delays, British designers adapted the existing hull form of the Mersey-class wooden frigates, replacing timber framing with iron beams and iron plating. The keel was laid in the same year Gloire was launched, in 1859. Warrior herself entered the water the following year and was fully commissioned by the summer of 1861. Despite the compressed timeline, Warrior was not a rushed or experimental design. Instead, she represented the culmination of several years of careful development. For her era, she was exceptionally fast. Under either sail or steam alone, she could maintain speeds of 13 to 14 knots. Her propeller could be raised clear of the water when not in use, reducing drag. When sail and steam were combined, she was capable of exceeding 17 knots, a remarkable figure for such a large and heavily armored ship. Her defensive protection was equally impressive. The main belt consisted of solid iron plates 4.5 inches thick, backed by 18 inches of teak. This wooden layer absorbed shock and prevented lethal fragments from spalling off the inner surface of the armor. Gunnery trials conducted in 1861 demonstrated that this arrangement was effectively immune to every naval gun then in service at any practical combat range. Only a handful of weapons, including American 15-inch rifled guns, were capable of penetrating the armor, and only at point-blank distance. Warrior also introduced another critical innovation, the armored citadel. This was a heavily protected central section of the ship, sealed off from all sides. It was designed so that even if the unarmored bow and stern were completely riddled and flooded, the ship would remain afloat. While such damage would almost certainly disable steering, the core of the vessel and her crew would survive. Originally, Warrior was intended to carry 40 68-pounder muzzle-loading guns, which were among the few weapons powerful enough to challenge heavy armor. However, promising early results from the new 110-pound breech-loading gun, designed by Armstrong, led to a revised armament scheme. The final configuration included 10 110-pound guns, 26 68-pound guns, and 4 40-pound guns. An all 110-pound battery was considered, but ultimately rejected. Further testing revealed significant weaknesses in the complexity and durability of the breech-loading mechanism. This change in armament layout meant that some guns were now positioned outside the armored citadel, whereas the original plan had placed all weapons under full protection. All of Warrior's guns were capable of firing both solid shot and explosive shells. In addition, the 68-pound guns could employ a unique and terrifying munition known as the Martin shell. Produced aboard ship using a forge, this shell contained molten iron rather than explosive filler. Upon impact, it shattered and sprayed liquid metal across its target. Against wooden ships, the effect was catastrophic. The molten fragments embedded themselves in hull planking, rigging, canvas, tar, and stored munitions, igniting multiple fires that reignited repeatedly as the metal slowly cooled. Warrior's launch itself became an event of legend. It took place during the coldest winter in 50 years, and the ship froze solid to the slipway. Freeing her required fires, tugboats, hydraulic rams, and crews running back and forth across the deck to generate vibration. Once afloat, she was soon joined by her sister ship, HMS Black Prince. With these two vessels, the balance of naval powers shifted once again. Though not exceptionally agile, Warrior and Black Prince were faster, larger, more heavily armed, better protected, and more technologically advanced than any potential opponent, including Gloire. Known as the Black Snakes of the Channel, they became part of the Channel Fleet and toured British ports as powerful symbols of national strength. Yet the introduction of a seemingly invincible warship did not secure permanent dominance. Instead, it triggered an international arms race. Faced with such a disruptive threat, other naval powers were forced to modernize rapidly or risk strategic irrelevance. Within just 4 years, Warrior herself was rearmed with 7 and 8-inch guns capable of piercing her own armor at close range. Her existence compelled artillery designers worldwide to dramatically improve gun performance. The adoption of steel shot in more industrialized nations further increased the lethality of naval weapons. To extend the operational reach of Britain's growing ironclad fleet, Warrior and Black Prince escorted a floating dry dock across the Atlantic to Bermuda. This allowed British iron warships to operate for extended periods far from home ports. However, technological progress moved relentlessly forward. After only a decade of frontline service, Warrior was already becoming obsolete as a first-rate combat vessel. She remained useful, as many wooden ships and early ironclads were still in service worldwide. Nonetheless, naval design evolved rapidly, from broadside batteries to central battery layouts, and then to turreted, mastless ships. The commissioning of HMS Devastation marked this transition decisively. The earlier concept of turreted ships with masts suffered a fatal blow with the loss of HMS Captain in a storm, an incident witnessed by Warrior herself. 4 years after Devastation entered service, Warrior was reassigned as a guard ship in the 1st Reserve Fleet. Over time, she was successively reclassified as a 3rd-class battleship and later as an armored cruiser. By 1900, she was no longer considered a combat vessel at all and was repurposed as a stationary hull for torpedo training. She was sold in the mid-1920s. For the next 50 years, stripped of equipment and filled with concrete, Warrior served as an oil jetty near Pembroke Dock in Wales. Despite this treatment, the extraordinary strength of her iron hull endured. By the late 1970s, she was still afloat. When her services as a jetty were no longer required, the Royal Navy donated the ship for preservation. Throughout the 1980s, Warrior was carefully restored. Replica masts, engines, machinery, and guns were constructed and installed to reflect her appearance in 1862. In 1987, she was towed to Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, where she now stands alongside Victory, Mary Rose, and Monitor M33 as part of the National Museum of the Royal Navy.